Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our second speaker is Gary Furnell, and it's great to welcome him back. Gary spoke at last year's conference, and when I was giving thought to this topic, I know what a wide range of cultural and literary interests Gary has. He's a fellow librarian, I have to admit, but it seemed to me that he'd have all sorts of possibilities, and he'll be addressing one of those topics today. He's a public librarian and a frequent contributor to various literary and cultural journals. Regular writer for Quadrant, publishing essays on literature and philosophy and religion, as well as short fiction. And he's been writing for a magazine called Studio, Christian Arts Quarterly, for a couple of decades. His current long-term project, which is nearly completed, is a thematic treatment of the Hebrew wisdom books of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, with Gary's thoughts supplemented by the much deeper thoughts, he's told me, of Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French polymath, Edmund Burke, the 18th century English parliamentarian, Soren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, and G.K. Chesterton. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Gary to speak to us in our second session.
Thank you, Carl, for that introduction, and thank you, Stephen, for your first talk. Some of the points there will resonate with mine for sure, including one of your quotes. To begin with, here is an observation by Auguste Renoir, the French painter. The more I read Renoir's observations and look at his art, the more I like him. It's relevant to today's discussion. Renoir said, "I am well aware that it is difficult to accept that a painter can produce truly great works and remain happy. Simply because Fragonard enjoyed a laugh, he came to be considered as a minor painter. People given to laughter are never taken seriously. Art in a frock coat, whether in painting, music or literature, will always rule the day." In part, what I want to do today is explore why solemn art in a frock coat, rules the day, and I also want to explore why it shouldn't have so much exclusive prominence. As I proceed, I want to build a sort of theology of comedy, hence the subtitle of my paper, Some Crumbs Towards a Theology of Comedy. In his defence of laughter, an essay, Chesterton said that any discussion of comedy and laughter is self-defeating if it adopts a serious, po-faced attitude. He wanted, for consistency's sake, that the examination of humour and laughter itself be comedic. So he set me, and all of the presenters, the tone for today's conference, and it should not be solemn. It is very Chestertonian to be light of heart, but with the mind grounded in reason and dogma. So I'll begin, as I believe Chesterton would have me begin, by articulating the foundational dogma for all that follows. Please don't go to sleep while I read the next two paragraphs. If the first essential truth of Buddhism is true, that is, to live is to suffer, then there is perhaps no great scope for a theology of comedy. But if the first essential truth of Judeo-Christianity is true, in the beginning God made heaven and earth, and behold it was very good, then there is much more scope for a theology of comedy, because all that is an expression of purposeful love. Man's good disposition and instincts, including the instinct for comedy and laughter, are aspects of his given nature and are not absurd, nor a utilitarian means for coping with difficulties, but they are meant to be. And their purpose is simply to allow man to enjoy and to develop in enjoyment the things that God has given to him. As Sir Roger Scruton notes in his latest book on human nature, Laughter is something that is uniquely human. No other animal laughs. In addition, Scruton noted that Darwinian attempts to explain laughter along naturalistic lines have all proved hopelessly inadequate. Another truth of Judeo-Christianity is that man and nature are fallen. They are not, in this present age, what they are intended to be. The fall into abnormality has affected every part of man's nature, including how we view the world and what we find funny. Comedy is creative and complex. The more creative the comedy, the more it delights us. Likewise, the more complex the comedy, the more it's funny at a number of levels at the one time, the more we delight in it. In the same way, comedy is best enjoyed in company and through company. We like to participate with one another in comedy. For example, by being left to make the link in our imagination between a joke's preamble and its punchline. Again, as Sir Roger Scruton observed, laughter seems to have a beneficial effect on human communities because those who laugh together also grow together and win through their laughter a mutual toleration of their all too human defects. Those aspects of comedy reflect the creativity and complexity of the created world. They also reflect in man's nature the image of the divine nature, which, although degraded by the fall, still defines man. We all experience sorrow and pain and death, but these do not ultimately define humanity. It is joy, wonder, community and thankfulness that are man's best and native territory. Chesterton, whose thinking informed much of the dogma of what I've just said, and much of what follows, lamented that many people, especially creative people, saw comedy as frivolous compared to sombre, serious works. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, for example, had a gravity that properly depressed people, but the Marx Brothers only made them laugh. Chesterton thought this kind of emphasis was wholly misplaced. He said, whoops, sorry, I might have gone too far there. I'll read the quote. "Nothing in this strange age of transition is so depressing as its merriment. All the most brilliant men of their age, when they set about the writing of comic literature, do it under the one destructive fallacy and disadvantage, the notion that comic literature is in some sort of way superficial. Not only is comic literature not superficial, but writing it really well and inventively is much harder work than writing serious literature. It takes more energy, more creativity and rich imagination to be inventively funny than it does to be solemn and sad. Unending seriousness is an unending surrender to entropy. It is the prone position of lassitude. Is there one serious writer who has the consistent zest and skillful facility with the English language as the comic writer P.G. Wodehouse? His prose, especially the Jeeves and the Bertie stories, make the prose of many literary prize winners seem fatigued. The celebrated playwrights, novelists, filmmakers, poets and artists who so relentlessly present to us their urgent and grave works depicting social problems, dysfunction, alienation, oppression and despair may be in fact displaying their low levels of energy and imagination. It takes real energy, real creativity, real skill and real love for one's art to produce a really fresh and effective comedy. As Chesterton said, a person has to be fully alive to laugh with gusto. Chesterton thought that joy was intended for mankind, so creative and artistic works that brought joy and wonder were not just a palliative or a seasonal variation to a predominant severity. They were, in fact, the best and truest expression of life. They were anything but superficial. The strange privilege of importance given to sombre art expresses an emotional attitude that is characteristic of modern culture. That is, its underlying nihilism has twisted its perspective so that innocent laughter is suspect, and a sense of jocularity is seen as hopelessly inadequate. The morose disposition of the age's prevailing emotions is therefore on display. And now we've got the right slide. This is Chesterton. I myself have little doubt that is due to the astonishing and ludicrous lack of belief in hope and hilarity which marks modern aesthetics to such an extent that it is spread even to the revolutionists, once the most hopeful section of men, so that even those who ask us to fling the stars into the sea are not quite sure they will be any better there than they were before. Chesterton went on to say that this was an expression not of man's maturity, but of his immaturity. In the same ways that teenagers are easily depressed and readily attracted by the macabre, so modern secular man is especially focused on the bleak and the dysfunctional. Contemporary culture doesn't value farce and pantomime, to take two examples of joyful, possibility-filled art, because the emotions they expressed are increasingly alien to contemporary people. Chesterton said this: "The artistic justification, then, of farce and pantomime must consist in the emotions of life which correspond to them. And these emotions are, to an incredible extent, crushed out by the modern insistence on the painful side of life only. Pain, it is said, is the dominant element of life. But this is true only in a very special sense. If pain were for one single instant, literally the dominant element of life, every man would be found dead, hanging from his own bedpost in the morning." He went on to say this. Oops, I'll try to get it. "Nothing in this strange age of transition is so depressing as its merriment." Oh, sorry, I've just got the wrong one there again. I'll go back. He said, "Pain, as the black and catastrophic thing, attracts the youthful artist, just as the schoolboy draws devils and skeletons and men hanging. But joy is the far more elusive and elfish matter, since it is our reason for existing and a very feminine reason. It mingles with every breath we draw and every cup of tea we drink. The literature of joy is infinitely more difficult, more rare and more triumphant than the black and white literature of pain." So even farce and pantomime, very knockabout forms of humour, had their defender in Chesterton. We might say that a delight in laughter, a great sense of comedy, are the mark of a really mature and balanced person, as Stephen intimated this morning. Chesterton thought another reason for pantomime and farce being so little esteemed was because a sense of fantastical possibilities among the commonplaces of life does not currently enjoy intellectual credibility. Unfortunately, deterministic biology, deterministic social conditions are seen as so constraining that Jesus' statement that with God all things are possible is regarded as the outmoded faith of a bygone era. We, being so clever of course, cannot in all seriousness entertain those hopes for our world or for ourselves anymore. So the art forms that embody a free and playful possibility are thought to be of little worth. But this is a totally arbitrary truncation of the human imagination. and we are the poorer without this expression of freedom-based form of comedy. Here is Chesterton again. To the quietest human being, seated in the quietest house, there will sometimes come a sudden and unmeaning hunger for the possibilities or the impossibilities of things. He will abruptly wonder whether the teapot may not suddenly begin to pour out honey or seawater, the clock to point to all hours of the day at once, the candle to burn green or crimson, the door to open upon a lake or a potato field instead of a London street. Upon anyone who feels this nameless anarchism, there rests for the time being the abiding spirit of pantomime. Of course, farce and pantomime are ridiculous. Of course, they're a little mad. But that's only because man himself is more than a bit ridiculous and more than a little mad. And it is part of our humanity to want to explore the potential freakishness of nature, because both man and nature are freaks. Chesterton knew that comedy and humour are evidence of life. In fact, he thought comedy and humour were such important evidences of life that we could even judge a thing as big as religion by how much it lent itself to humour. Yet people pride themselves on being so serious. Michael, could I just ask you to have a look at this so we can get back on track with the slides? Digest for a moment, people, and while we just have a look at this. I've just up to. It's much easier to read at good times. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you. Now, just leave it like that if you don't want to. I know that's going to be a little bit distracting, but that'll make it easier for me. Sure. That little technical hitch was not part of the talk, but it does highlight something I'm going to come just emphasise in a moment, which is the ridiculous nature of myself. In his book, Orthodoxy, he said, how's that digesting? Did you do some good digesting while we just did that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Did some breathing?
Yes.
Good. Back to Chesterton. Pride is the downward drag of all things into an easy solemnity. One settles down into a sort of selfish seriousness, but one has to rise to a gay self-forgetfulness. A man falls into a brown study, he reaches up to a blue sky. Seriousness is not a virtue. It would be a heresy, but a much more sensible heresy, to say that seriousness is a vice. It really is a natural trend or lapse into taking oneself gravely, because that's the easier thing to do. It is much easier to write a good Times leading article than a good joke in Punch, for solemnity flows out of men naturally, but laughter is a leap. It's easy to be heavy, hard to be light. Satan fell by the force of gravity. I would also add that a great comedian is a rarity. The ability to imagine and produce original comedy is a gift, and like all great gifts, it is comparatively rare. Very few people have the comedic gift of P.G. Wodehouse, the Marx Brothers, Jacques Tati, Woody Allen, Francis Weber, the French filmmaker, Clive James or Barry Humphries. Flannery O'Connor, a witty writer herself, observed that nature is not prodigal in producing geniuses, and that applies to comedy as much as to any other special gift. It comes from somewhere else and is given to the blessed and usually hard-working person. I think Chesterton was particularly gifted in humour, and I'm sure that his spiritual perspective on life helped him to see, appreciate and express comedy. And this leads me to suggest that stable convictions aid comedy. Dogmas promote that promote the virtues of decency, modesty and dignity do not hinder comedy. Rather, they permit it by providing a firm framework for fun. Once again, Roger Scruton makes the point that to laugh is to make some kind of firm judgment about something. Flannery O'Connor said that to see the world as a comedy, you need to have firm convictions. She said that two reasons modern writers have to struggle so hard to find humour in their writing is because, one, they're not sure man has a soul, and two, their convictions are always changing. This is her observation. Only if we are secure in our beliefs can we see the comical side of the universe. One reason a great deal of our contemporary fiction is humourless is because so many of these writers are relativists and have to be continuously justifying the actions of their characters on a sliding scale of values. I want to develop the idea that convictions aid comedy, and in particular the convictions of decency and modesty, by looking at the comedy of Nina Conti, a ventriloquist. I'd also like to look at the great novelist Jane Austen and the Australian Kransky sisters, a musical trio. It's certainly possible for a comedian to be very funny, to be contemporary, and to insist on correct behaviour. It is in fact one of the best ways for women in particular to be witty. Chesterton wrote this: women generally have the strong sense that if they don't insist on correct behaviour, no one else will. Babies are not strong on points of dignity, and we grown men, particularly we grown single men, are quite unpresentable. He also said this: the two things that a healthy person hates most between heaven and hell are a woman who is not dignified, but a man who is. In other words, decorum and decency at a deeply intuitive and spiritual level are especially important to women and properly valued by the most sensible of women. And it is this point that so many contemporary comedians sell themselves short while others succeed so well. The foul-mouthed delivery of a postmodern woman comic telling the audience about her sexually transmitted disease caught after a one-night stand with her best friend's ex-fiancé is destroying her own dignity and decorum in her search for laughter, and she's contributing to the furtherance of bad form, all of which is at odds with women's innate and great good sense that firm decorum is necessary to ensure a tolerable sociality. If everyone were rude and impolite, then society would not be worth living in. Women generally understand this better than men. Nina Conti uses ventriloquism. I'll just put Nina back up because she's quite attractive. Uses ventriloquism to achieve this complex combination of decency, decorum and hilarity. One of her dummies, this little primate, with a weird Anglo-Indian accent called Monk, says cheeky and insulting things to the audience or to Nina, while Nina attempts to control these witticisms and direct him towards kindness and prudence. Now, by design, she fails, yet she tries consistently. And so Nina Conti is funny without violating common community standards or her own dignity. Instead, she seeks to uphold them, and the contrast she provides to Monkey is a source of much of the humour. Her inventive comedy is a success without needing to rely on the thin cliché of a success through scandal. Nina Conti is following a tradition of women's wit that has Jane Austen as one of its notable exemplars. In all her novels, Jane Austen demonstrated that she had a keen understanding for the potential for humour if indecency sat right down next to decency. The crass behaviour of Lydia Bennet in Pride and Prejudice gains in dramatic and comedic value because Lydia's indifference to decorum is juxtaposed by the steady modesty of her sisters, Jane and Elizabeth. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is funny because she assumes the status of aristocracy, graces her with dignity, but this is subverted by her pride and her meddling arrogance. And the common sense of Jane, again, provides the contrast. The possibilities for a loss of decorum are as varied as the circumstances, and therefore the possibilities for comedy are equally rich as long as manners are non-negotiable and commonly understood. Comedy begins when characters lose moral balance and allow vanity, hedonism, or status to eclipse decorum. It's in the nature of the case that we don't laugh with them, we laugh at them. But, and this is where we are at the moment, if all the Bennet family and all the rest of their society were as delinquent as Lydia about decorum, then the opportunities for and the sharpness of the comedy is greatly reduced. It's one reason why the Bridget Jones books and films, for example, have to work so much harder for their effects than Jane Austen's comedy. The comedy is clunky, it's heavy-handed compared to Jane Austen because modern Western society is relatively indifferent to firm manners. Bridget Jones isn't the exception in her society. Her indiscretions and dysfunctions are the rule. They're common, not uncommon. Where's the contrast when everyone is equally crass? Folly and indecency can't sit next to decorum if decorum is constantly being shoved into a tiny corner like Carl has been. It will be no surprise if comics leave less and less unsaid and undisclosed as they search for elusive laughter which must be hounded out of a diminishing reserve of dignity and modesty. Modesty in sexual matters is another part of the firm framework of conviction which provides opportunities for comedy. Comics, including female comics, who accept this framework and then play against it, have another rich field for comedy compared to their colleagues who don't recognise that framework or who obliterate it and thus lose the opportunity for comedy born of contrast. The comedy of these three wonderful ladies, the Australian Kransky sisters, is founded in large measure on their sexual modesty, expressed in their anachronistic, old-styled clothing. They have long-sleeved white blouses buttoned up to the throat. They have ankle-length black shapeless skirts that leave little flesh to be seen other than their pale hands and pale faces. It's as if a sign of the Addams family had been hibernating since the 1950s in the rural town of Esk, where the Kranskys were raised, and then woke up decades later to bring their peculiar music and odd family history to audiences around the world. Their insistence in their shows on an almost obsessive modesty allows the Kranskys to hint at just some small improprieties by other members of their extended family and makes them hilarious. Their modesty does not limit their comedy. It creates it by providing something firm to measure aberration against. They don't mention their periods, their one-night stands, or their nipple-piercing experiences because all this is completely foreign to them, and not one swear word passes their lips as they unfold their odd family history and sing their strange songs. Indeed, it's hard to imagine the Kranskys swearing or indulging in any grossness at all. It would be badly out of character. Even when they sing on the saw, that super old keyboard and the tuba, even when they sing Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing or the 1976 hit Afternoon Delight, the performance gains in strange appeal because they seem to be oblivious to the sensuality of the lyrics. What they sing is weirdly at odds with how they look and behave, and the audience relishes the incongruity. We lap it up. Besides modesty and decorum, another conviction or dogma that provides for comedy is human dignity. The highest view of mankind, that each one of us is made in the image of God and is akin in some ways with divinity, is a conviction that gives comedy a special edge. It is because we are dignified creatures that good slapstick is so funny. Charlie Chaplin knew this, and so he dressed his hobo character in a formal hat, a bowler hat, a three-piece suit, and gave him a walking cane. And when he suffers or causes indignities, the contrast between his attempt at dignity and the chaos that ensues makes it funny. It wouldn't be funny if there was no clear difference between human dignity and indignity. Chesterton said that man's comedy is born of his immense dignity and the fact that anything in reality, however humble, like a banana skin or a gust of wind, could trip him up or have him in a tangle. This is from his essay on running after one's hat. There is an idea that it is humiliating to run after one's hat, and people say it is humiliating, and when people say it is humiliating, they mean it is comic. It is certainly comic, but man is a very comic creature, and most of the things he does are comic. Eating, for example, and the most comic things of all are exactly the things that are most worth doing, such as making love. A man running after his hat is not so half as ridiculous as a man running after his wife. Barbara Pym is an English author who was popular in the 1940s and 1950s and then had a resurgence of popularity in the 1980s when she won the Booker Prize. She was a devout Anglican lady. Pym's novels are animated by the sense that people are wonders who are caught up in a tangle of trivialities, and so we become ridiculous. Yet despite this, we try to live lives of dignity and achievement. Humanity's tangles wouldn't be so comic if our dignity wasn't so firm. It's a perspective born from the Christian conception of man as a fallen lord, a dispossessed king. It's comedy that comes from an elevated spiritual conception of man, which is in contrast to man's fallen condition. And when we measure ourselves this way, we see our ridiculousness. When I, as a prime example of ridiculous humanity, wake up in the morning, bleary-eyed, my hair sticking up all over the place, I look ridiculous. And when I see myself coming out of the shower naked in a full-length mirror, I look ridiculous. And if I square my shoulders and suck in my gut and stand a bit tall, I still look ridiculous, but now I look ridiculous in a totally different way. Lots of my habits and routines, my fears and pretensions, my dreams and my daydreams are totally ridiculous. Lots of the things I think and say and imagine are astonishingly ridiculous. But I'm not alone in this. The life of every single human being is a work of sublime comedy. If you don't think this applies to you, just think of the intimacies of the bathroom and the bedroom. Think of your daydreams. Think of your pretensions. Think of the conversations you have with yourself. It's all ridiculous. This isn't morbid self-loathing. It's healthy self-laughing. I balance this sense of my deeply ridiculous self with my status as an exalted self, made to share in the divine nature. That gift elevates me, which is very different from me elevating myself. Pascal says that the Christian is in the unique position of being able to humble himself without despair and exalt himself without pride. Chesterton said that a thing called good spirits is possible only to the spiritual. Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, was dear to Chesterton because it portrayed the spiritual as comic and even as frivolous. Chesterton thought Macbeth was probably Shakespeare's greatest play because it was a powerful portrayal of human liberty and its consequences for good or evil. We have the ability to be a blessing or a curse, with these august choices taking place in a moral universe which will not be cheated or tricked. But the play Chesterton enjoyed was A Midsummer Night's Dream, a fantasy of gods and lovers and common rustics. He enjoyed it because it was the genius of Shakespeare to perceive and portray the joy of spiritual things, the fun of the divine things. This isn't common. Think of all the portrayals of the supernatural in books, in movies, and on television. The spirits are nearly always malignant. In my years as a public librarian, I noticed how immensely popular are the horror books of Stephen King and Dean Koontz. More recently, there's been the many vampire books of Anne Rice, Stephanie Meyer, Charlene Harris, and now there's all the zombie movies and television series such as The Walking Dead. In all of them, the supernatural is seen as a threat to humanity, dangerous and destructive more often than not. The Harry Potter books are somewhat unusual because in them the supernatural is both good and bad. But broadly speaking, the mystical is mostly perceived as malicious. Chesterton blamed the truncated view of the Puritans for that imbalance, which continues today. And again, I think this next comment of Chesterton's will answer one of the questions about the post-Reformation view of humour, or lack of humour. Here it is. Puritanism cast away the generous and wholesome superstition. It approved only of the morbid and dangerous. In their treatment of the great national fairy tale of good and evil, the Puritans killed St. George, but they kept the dragon. And this 17th century tradition of dealing with the psychic life lies like a great shadow over England and America and Australia, so that if we glance at a novel about occultism, we may be perfectly certain that it deals with a sad or evil destiny, but not A Midsummer Night's Dream. Chesterton says this: the sentiment of such a play, as much as it can be summed up at all, can be summed up in one sentence. It is the mysticism of happiness. That is to say, it is the conception that as a man lives upon a borderland, he may find himself in the spiritual or supernatural atmosphere, not only through being profoundly sad or meditative, but by being extravagantly happy. I'll just continue with the quote using the slide. Extravagantly happy. The soul might be wrapped out of the body in an agony of sorrow or a trance of ecstasy, but it might also be wrapped out of the body in a paroxysm of laughter. Sorrow, we know, can go beyond itself, so, according to Shakespeare, can pleasure go beyond itself and become something dangerous and unknown. And the reason that the logical and destructive modern school, of which Mr. Bernard Shaw is an example, does not grasp this purely exuberant nature of Shakespeare's comedy is simply that their logical and destructive attitude have rendered impossible their experience of this preternatural exuberance. In the Epistle to the Epistle to the Hebrews, we read of the redeemed joining in the joyful assembly of angels. There the mystical is merry. And that brings me to my final point. The search for the mystical can be comical. The search for man's meaning can be a source of mirth. Flannery O'Connor never got to write it because she died quite young. But she thought there was a richly comic novel to be written about a proud intellectual woman being drawn despite herself into the Christian faith. Think of the comic possibilities of someone like Hillary Clinton, for example, slowly becoming sure that her real vocation was to become a Pentecostal lady pastor, especially if it was in a small town full of redneck deplorables. Imagine the comedy in prospective Chancellor Angela Merkel, for instance, found her horror that God's Spirit was leading her to become a cloistered nun, praying for the world rather than strutting about the world. Fortunately, there is one person on the planet telling these sorts of stories, and that is Woody Allen. He almost alone is a film director and screenwriter who makes man's search for meaning, man's search for God, into a major theme in many of his movies. It's in the first two collections of his New Yorker stories that religious searching, questions about death and the afterlife, and the desire for certainty takes centre stage with hilarious results. In the play Death Knocks, a man's death tries to make a dramatic entrance by appearing through his apartment window. But in front of the man whose life he's supposed to take, Death stumbles over the windowsill and falls flat on his face. Embarrassed and somewhat dazed, Death gets up and is immediately duped by the man and sent packing. In another work called God, a Play, two ancient Greeks are on stage, an actor and a playwright. They argue over the unsatisfactory end of the play, end of life, but finally decide to buy the latest gadget for every theatrical difficulty, the Deus Ex Machina, newly invented by Westinghouse. They're told Sophocles put a deposit...
Stop doing his homework!
What's the point?
What has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding.
It won't be expanding for billions of years yet, Alvy. And we've got to try and enjoy ourselves while we're here, huh? Huh?
Thank you, Carl.
In which a baby's physical ridiculousness, together with their humility and dignity, is all linked to mystical comedy. Chesterton especially liked the weird proportions and the bulbous heads of babies. This is what he said about these little creatures. The humorous look of babies is perhaps the most endearing of all the bonds that hold the universe together. Their top-heavy dignity is more touching than any humility. Their solemnity gives us more hope for all things than 1,000 carnivals of optimism. Their large and lustrous eyes seem to hold all the stars in their astonishment. Their fascinating absence of nose seems to give us the most perfect hint of the humour that awaits us in the kingdom of heaven. Thank you for your attention.
Very much, Gary. Quite a gallery of literary references, movies, and everybody included. Are there any questions or comments?
No.
Yeah,
This is like man facing an intellectual firing squad.
A couple of weeks ago, I had a long conversation with one of my daughters who was the Lord of the Rings fan about the hobbits and how they would have first breakfast, second breakfast, 11s, early lunch, second lunch, etc. And I had never really looked at the Lord of the Rings as a humorous text. Do you have any comments on that?
I intensely dislike Tolkien, so I'm not the right person to ask that question. Yeah, sorry. Well, yeah, I'm not a Tolkien fan. Yeah, I'm sorry to shock. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question, but I'm happy to pass it to someone who's knowledgeable on Tolkien.
Thank you.
Has anyone got an answer to that question?
We move Richard.
Okay, thank you.
I'd say doesn't everybody?
Dislike Tolkien?
No, have first breakfast, second breakfast, morning.
You're talking to a bachelor, I'm right there with you. Sorry.
One of the things that struck me about comedy was about the Yes Minister series. That is absolutely brilliant. Because one of the writers was a ministerial advisor or whatever, you know, in the Harold Wilson Labor government in England in the 60s and 70s. But one of the brilliant things about comedy, as someone was saying, and I can't remember who it was, that you can get away with murder. I don't mean that we're going to murder anyone, but getting away with things without being sued for slander or libel or anything like that. And one of the greatest things I remember from Yes Minister, or Yes Prime Minister, I forget which one it was, that's the ages now, showing my age, that the best run hospital in England was those without patients.
Yes.
So I think some of those things are having a go at the political system that we've inherited from the UK, but they can get away with blue murder virtually in comedy, but if they try to say it outside, other than Coward's Castle, as we know the bear pit in Quarry Street is called, but comedy is so enlightening, and this is what Chesterton was able to do, using, and yourself too with the presentation, getting us more aware of fun things in life.
I think that's, I agree with you, and I was, in most of my writing, I'm guided by what it says in the ancient book of Proverbs, and it says that attractive speech is much more persuasive. And I think by Christians being endlessly solemn and grave, we're losing the option to persuade people. We need to embrace comedy, we need to embrace lightness, and that will make our message so much more attractive. I can't think of the exact proverb, and I don't want to butcher it, but it's something like gentle speech adds to learning, or an attractive tongue adds to learning. So I agree with you, and that's why I didn't want to present the solemn paper, and I wanted YouTube clips, and I wanted to be fun with it, because you're much more likely to listen, and I think we need to do that to the secular world. Yeah.
Go for it.